Good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you are. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I am Abbas Kadhim, Director of the Iraqi Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to this on-record important event. We are honored to host two Iraqi statesmen, His Excellency Dr. Ali Allawi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and His Excellency Dr. Fuad Hussein, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Republic of Iraq. They both are accompanying His Excellency Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi during his first visit since he took office to Washington, D.C. The delegation is quite impressive, both in quality and in the number of attendees, and the results so far, as we have been watching and following, have been very good. Many accomplishments, especially given the time that we are in with all of the challenges that the entire world is facing with coronavirus, and also the challenges that Iraq is facing. And we are very glad to host them. We are very grateful for their time. We are also grateful for our friend David Ignatius, a prominent columnist at the Washington Post and a friend of the Atlantic Council. All three gentlemen are in no need of introductions and biographies, even though we sent their biographies in the email and with the announcement. I am thankful to the Embassy of the Republic of Iraq for their hard work and cooperation to make this event possible, and for their cooperation and help and partnership with us throughout the years. Also, very thankful to our founding sponsor, Crescent Petroleum, and Mr. Majid Jafar, who is also with us. And with that, I leave the microphone and the stage, virtual stage that is, with my friend, Mr. David Ignatius, wishing you all a great and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
My thanks to Abbas Khadim, and I also want to thank the Atlantic Council for sponsoring this conversation. And I want to pay special thanks to Iraq's ambassador to Washington, Fareed Yassin, who has worked very hard to make this visit, and our conversation is a part of that visit, work smoothly. So we're lucky, as I think everyone in the audience knows, to have two of the wisest and most astute observers of Iraq with us today in our conversation. I won't go into lengthy introductions, but as you know, Dr. Ali Allawi was part of the story of Iraq from 2003 and the interim government, serving in that government. He wrote a brilliant book that many of us have read called The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace, which is one of the best studies of what happened that I know. Dr. Fuad Hussein has had a distinguished career both in the Kurdistan regional government and in Baghdad, serving in many posts. Dr. Fuad and I have talked many times over the years about the complicated issues facing the KRG in Iraq, and it's a pleasure to have both of you with us today. I want to begin with a question that I'm going to ask each of you to answer in turn, and that is to give us your assessment today, the day after Prime Minister al-Kadhimi met with President Trump, and after you had your own visits with senior administration officials. Give us your sense as of today of the state of the U.S.-Iraq relationship, what you think this visit has accomplished, and what you think is still left to be done. And let me begin, if I might, with the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Dr. Ali Allawi.
Thank you very much, David, and thank everybody else for being on this webinar. I was hoping you'd ask Dr. Fuad first, but since I put on the firing line, I have
you are older than me, so he's
yeah, but only by a few weeks, depending which calendar you use, Dr. Fuad. Anyway, the state of U.S.-Iraqi relationships obviously are determined by, it's not just by one factor, but by many factors. And they depend also on the perspectives, whether it's from Baghdad and in brackets, or Erbil and Washington itself. So it's quite a multivariate and complex matrix. I can speak on what I know of the Iraqi side, and I think I can sort of infer as to what's happening on the Washington side. We see our relationships in different, perhaps from a different axis than is seen in Washington. We see it in terms of a great power that has had a signal effect on the modern history of the country and has basically midwifed what I would call the new Iraqi state, which came into being in 2003. And that state relied a lot on the US security, diplomatic, and of course, economic and financial support at the beginning. And to some extent, you can say that the view from Baghdad is to what degree is this relationship still valid, is still intact, and how deep it is, given the various ups and downs that we've had. From Baghdad's point of view, most of the effort is looked at from the short term. I mean, tactically, what do the various governments and leaders of governments expect from this relationship? And generally is to do with strengthening the various political orientations that determine Iraqi politics. But also during times of crisis, like the Daesh crisis or earlier the al-Qaeda crisis, to the degree to which the United States can play a part in containing and eliminating the threats to this nascent state and to the political groups that dominate it. And I don't think this has changed much. It's seen primarily in terms of how the US can bolster the structures of this state and use the US power and influence to strengthen each of the groups that are competing or contending with the United States or against the United States. Obviously, it's seen in terms of also of the regional power struggles going on, which is again a multi-dimensional chessboard, including in the last 18 years, the Gulf countries, Iran, of course, Turkey, and Syria, and how these, in one way or the other, impinge on the domestic circumstances in Iraq. The United States sees it, I think, obviously from a different point of view. In the very early days, it was basically how Iraq can become a pivot of the American presence in the Middle East and how we can restructure, as it were, the politics of the area around the evolving Iraqi state. But in time, of course, it's taken on a different dimension. During the ISIS crisis, that overwhelmed most other considerations. Now, I think the United States sees Iraq primarily in terms of Iran and the extent and range and scope of Iran's influence in Iraq and how that can be contended with and contained. So the outcomes of this visit, this particular visit, I think has to be set against these two markers, and whether these two markers meet in order to create sort of a coherent bilateral type of understanding is another matter. So I'll stop here and have Dr. Fuad very keen to hear his answer.
Dr. Fuad, let me ask you the same question, but perhaps you could focus particularly on the question of security dialogue you met on Wednesday with Secretary of State Pompeo at the State Department for a part of that dialogue. Our impression after the White House meeting was that there is an understanding between the U.S. and Iraq that U.S. combat troops will be leaving, but there's no timetable specified, and that Iraq is comfortable with some U.S. troops remaining for the purpose of training the Iraqi security forces. Tell me if that's an accurate summary, and what else you think has been accomplished in these meetings.
Let me thank Brother Abbas, and thank you, David. I'm glad to see you again. As for your question, going back to the dialogue, which started about a month ago or 2 months ago, the first round of the dialogue started in Baghdad and in communicating with Washington, and now the delegation is here. So on Wednesday, we had our meeting, and we reached an agreement, and of course, the statement, the joint statement make clear, as of course, security paragraph is clear that we agreed about the following. First, we are talking about redeployment of the American forces from Iraq. And we are talking also about timing and to have a schedule for redeployment. And we are also mentioning forming a technical committee to observe we agreed about these issues, and we left it for the technical committee to deal with it. Why we left it to the technical committee? Because it has to do with mostly military and security issues. And we hope that when we will be back, we will form from our side this technical committee, and it will be a joint technical committee with the American, so that they can come together and decide about how they will develop the timetable. Of course, we talked also about the target. Where are we going? I mean, we started on Wednesday, and do we have a clear target? Yes, the target is to have American forces, or to have cooperation with American on security level, but in different way. We need the American to advise our military forces and security forces. We need the American to give training. We need American intelligence cooperation on that field. So how are we going to translate all these issues into reality? As for the numbers, the place, the legal issue surrounding this, having American forces there. So we agreed about all these. But the technical side, we left it to the technical committee.
And Dr. Fuad, these are complicated issues. How long do you think it will take the technical committee to work through them and resolve them? This sounds like work that could take as much as a year, but maybe I'm misunderstanding.
David, the decision must be joint decision. So it's not only Iraqi decision, it must be also American decision, but it will be in cooperation with each other. That's one. Second, this technical committee, when we will be back, it will be formed, okay? And we are demanding also the American side to form their group, and then they will come together. It is up to them to decide and to have this timetable. So, but we are mentioning timing. We are mentioning the timetable. But to deal with the timetable, to translate the timetable into reality, this is their work, not our work. I don't know. So, but it will be soon. I mean, the technical committee, they will come together soon, and they will be formed soon, and then they will discuss about it. But it is clear for us, that we decided both sides to reshape the existence of the American forces there. We need the American, but in a different way.
Let me ask Dr. Allawi, thinking about this long story that began in 2003 and has been so painful for Iraq and for the United States also, do you think that after this visit, after what Dr. Fuad described as this agreement on a limited American role in training, advising, supporting the Iraqi security forces, that we've reached finally a stable point in this relationship after, so many years of going up and down like a yo-yo, overreaching and then almost vanishing? Are we finally now at something that's sustainable?
I think no, we're in a state of what I would call unstable equilibrium. The US is unclear whether the US is prepared to make the necessary commitment to a re-evaluation or a recalibration of this relationship with Iraq. What I've heard so far is that the US engagement is really conditional. It's conditional on a number of things taking place, without which the US may not feel comfortable in maintaining this kind of strategic alliance. From the point of view of Iraq, a lot of the actions relating to the United States are to some extent, or to a large extent, driven by domestic considerations and the domestic power equation, where you have groups that are near or not so near to the United States or to Iran and other competing forces, trying to define the relationship in a way that increases the security and stability of the country, but also the specific political groups that are promoting this kind of policy. So right now, there seems to be a congruence of views and opinions that creates a temporary equilibrium where the United States basically is really not averse to maintaining a very small residual presence. It is averse to maintaining a much larger presence, a much more significant presence than had been originally assumed. But at the same time, there are indications that the United States would not spend sleepless nights in the event that their forces withdrew from the area. So it is a function of the kind of vacuums and threats that might emerge, and whether these are best contained or controlled by a residual American presence. From the point of view of Iraq, the presence of the United States gives some kind of security blanket feeling that in the case the Daesh or the post-Daesh environment creates additional security or dangerous security threats, whether we are capable, given the internal issues and the weaknesses of Iraq's institutions, including the security forces, whether it's able to contain and to manage an escalation of the threat. Personally, I think that is the main drive that should be the basis of a strategic security-based relationship. But of course, the presence of the United States in a visible way also weighs in favor or against competing political parties for, if you want to call it, the soul of Iraq, although I wouldn't be so dramatic about it, but which axis the country is going to be drawn towards. And this has been going back and forth for some time. And it has ebbs and flows. And this is really not the making of a national consensus. So for us to benefit from this kind of, to move the unstable equilibrium to an equilibrium, you have to have a national consensus because it requires anchoring the long-term strategic interests of the country to a particular power block. And this may not be as easily forthcoming as people expect.
So I want to ask Dr. Fuad about one subject that I know was discussed between President Trump and Prime Minister al-Kadhimi, and that is your neighbor, Iran. And it's my understanding that President Trump expressed in the meeting yesterday, as he often does in public, U.S. concerns about Iran and Iranian power in the region, Iran's interference in Iraqi affairs as the U.S. sees it. And it's my understanding that your prime minister said that he had tried to make clear to Iran that Iraq seeks its sovereignty, that Iraq wants non-interference, state-to-state relationship with Iran and other states, but not relations with individuals or individual militias. Am I describing accurately, Dr. Fuad, the Iraqi view about your relations with your powerful neighbor in Tehran?
David, you see, as the relationship with the United States is rather complicated, I mean, Iraqi relationship with Iran, it is the same. There are some facts which has to do with the recent history. It was under the leadership of the American army that Iraq has been, or the change happened in Baghdad in 2003, and Saddam Hussein has been removed. This was in the interest of Iraqi people, of course, removing Saddam Hussein. But it was also in the interest of regional power, especially Iran. As many people know, the Iranian and Iraqis, they were in war for 8 years, from 1980 until 1988. And Iraq invaded Kuwait. And Iraq then had very bad relationship with almost all Gulf countries. So removing Saddam Hussein was in the interest of many countries, including neighboring countries and including Iran. And after the collapse of the regime and with the new political process, there was a new situation. Many neighboring countries started to intervene in Iraqi affairs in different way. And that's valid for Iran. What Prime Minister Kadhimi told the Iranian is exactly what you have mentioned. We want to have a good relationship with Iran. Iran is our neighbor, and the longest border that we have is with Iran. And of course, if we go back to the relationship between Iran and Iraq, it has also to do with the history, with culture, with the religious, as well as economic ties. So the influence of Iranian is there. This is part of the reality. But a country can have influence in another country or another society, but the decision must be in the hands of the Iraqis. We have got some problem in this field. And I think one of the issues that Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi raised it in Tehran, and we were with him, both of us, my colleague Ali Allawi and myself. And I was in the meeting with him when he met the president of Iran, President Rouhani, and he made it clear we want to have relations, but on the basis of being equal, the state to a state relation. And until 3 years ago, there was a kind of gentleman accord between Washington and Tehran when issues in Iraq has been solved. And it is a fact. We are talking about facts, and it is a bitter fact that sometimes both countries, they were deciding who will be the next prime minister. They were deciding indirectly or through other channels, but it was a kind of gentleman agreement between Tehran and Washington. When the conflict started between both capitals, this conflict for many other countries, for many other nations, it is an external issue. But because of the situation since 2003 inside Iraq, and because of the influence of the Iranian inside Iraq, and because of the fact that the Americans, they were there with their huge army until 2011, and then the American influence is still there. I mean, people choose. There are some political parties, they are supporting the link and good cooperation with the United States. There are some other political parties supporting and having good relationship with Iran. Because of these issues, in fact, the conflict between Washington and Tehran, it reflects itself inside Iraq, inside our political parties, and inside our parliament. So we got this problem which has to do with us, but it is not in our hand. How are we going to deal with this? We must be frank with both sides. You have got conflict, okay? We don't want to be part of this conflict, but we need both of you. One of them is our neighbor and big power in the region, and the other one is our ally and big power in the world. And we are desperately in need for both sides, but each for different things, but with one condition. They must not make the decision for us. And in this case, the Iranians are intervening more to decide for us. They have got different position inside our political system. So the Prime Minister wanted to make it clear for the Iranian, please, we want to have normal relationship, but you are not going to decide for us. This is the case. Are we going to succeed? I don't know. There are some political parties, perhaps they are not happy with this policy. But at the end, we are responsible and we must express ourselves. And our policy is depending totally on the interests of Iraqi people and not on the interests of the others.
Dr. Fuad, thank you. That's a helpful answer. I want to ask Dr. Ali about the other major aspect of this visit, and that is discussion of U.S. Iraqi economic cooperation. You have severe economic issues with COVID-19, the pandemic, with the collapse in oil prices, with the broader problem that I've seen in every trip to Iraq since I first went to Iraq in 1980, which is your dependence on oil exports and the rentier economy. I'm wondering, Dr. Ali, after the visit, whether you feel that there are new ways to talk about greater U.S. economic interaction with Iraq that will be helpful in dealing with these fundamentals?
I mean, the short answer is there are the circumstances. We can have the circumstances to change fundamentally the structure of the Iraqi economy and move it onto a different plane where the kind of support that might be coming from the United States will have the maximum impact and benefit. But again, you have to really contextualize all of this. The problems of the Iraqi economy are not so much lack of investment resources or foreign exchange constraints. They're just the result of a long period of extremely poor economic policies and strategies and extremely poor management of the economy, which has accumulated issues and problems, which have now reached a breaking point. You were in Iraq in 1980. This distortion has been going on, really, in one form or another, since the 1970s. There's been a series of shocks, ranging from moving from a private sector to an expropriated economy where most of the assets ended up in the state sector, to a war economy, to a sanctions economy, and then to this post-2003 chaos that we've had. So these problems have accumulated, and they have now reached, I think, very near the breaking point. In the past, these crises were camouflaged by other aspects. I mean, during the war economy, everything had to be mobilized to fund the war efforts. So Iraq ended up borrowing around $140 billion, which broke the back of the country after the war ended. And then you had the sanctions period, which again pauperized the population, and incomes collapsed to really nothing. I mean, paltry levels. And then you had this curious episode in the last 18 years of ballooning oil prices, which have been completely wasted in the sense that there's been no buildup of the necessary institutional base or infrastructure for a self-sustaining economy. All it ended up is just bloating the public sector. So the problems of the Iraqi economy will not be solved, I think, by greater or lesser engagement of the United States. They can be hindered by the withdrawal of international support. But the onus is on us really to do the necessary domestic reforms to create the environment that would allow for active and effective international engagement. So in the past, the US is really torn between its past experience and its desire to be involved in, first of all, in stabilizing the country, and secondly, to take advantage of what could be an interesting market. Nevertheless, I mean, the Iraqi economy is probably 20% that of Saudi Arabia. So you have to put things in scale. It will never be a very decisive market for the United States. So to me, the involvement of the US is much more important as a country that can put its weight and heft towards changing the axes of our domestic economic policies and to change the economic strategy and to give us the wherewithals to have a self-sustaining economy. So it's not so much the question of how much funds the US can give us. Frankly, I think it will be very little. If you ask the US Treasury, which we haven't, I don't think you'll get much, comfort in terms of the amount of money that can be offered. However, the US can affect international agencies, and on the margin, they do provide additional financing through the various US government-related agencies. Outside of the oil and gas sector and possibly the power sector, Iraq is not really a conducive place until these reforms take place for international investment. You can't expect multinationals that are extremely sensitive to issues of security, to issues of consistency of policies, to issues of foreign exchange, bureaucracy, and so on, to flood into a market that is still in many ways raw and has not yet formed the contours of a successful private economy. Then again, there's the other aspect to it, is that the US has spent, and this came up, and I'm sure you might have heard in the discussions, what have we gotten for this $4 trillion investment in the country? There's a general feeling that this is just a black hole, and just in pure pecuniary terms, the United States has not benefited from this relationship. And even if it does, it will take decades to get a quote unquote a return on this investment. So the US as a major supporter and a major backer of a consistent and well-constructed reform program, I think is really vital to ensuring that this reform program is in fact implemented. The other aspect of it is that Iraq itself has to situate the country in a more global, in a globalized world, in a world in which bilateral or multilateral alliances are being now seriously questioned, and whether we should hitch our wagon to bilateral or multilateral relationships, or perhaps even more in a more significant way by promoting a kind of regional economic union between the various countries of the Middle East, including Turkey and Iran. Of course, a lot of political issues here, and there's no doubt that these have to be. But if this is in the strategic interest and the manifest interest of the country and of the region, then obviously you have to contend with how the US would view such a regional trading and investment bloc. In my opinion, that if Iraq's international economic relations are set on a more rational and a more proactive basis regionally, then the US can look at Iraq as an anchor or as an important element of a significant regional market, in which case the market as a whole, not just of Iraq and its 40 million people, but the market of the greater Middle East, as it were, becomes the Arab countries of West Asia plus Turkey, maybe Iran, maybe at some point even Pakistan. That kind of grouping of countries, whether it's in the interest of the United States to be engaged with that or with each country individually. In the past, the US, I think, pushed for regional integration. I mean, it was supported the founding of the common market in the European Union, supported the founding of ASEAN and so on. But in the last years, the administration has a different strategic perspective, which is much more oriented towards bilateral relationships. So we have to decide what is it and how we're going to define our international economic relations, how we're going to set our domestic economy back on the right track. And on the basis of that, there's a lot that can be done with the United States as a critical element in this equation. So clarity is needed from our part. Strategic perspective is needed from our part. And we have to fit it into the perspective of the United States as it relates to the Middle East, and whether they think of it as on a country or a bilateral basis, or whether they think of it in terms of just the strategic contention going on between the US and Iran. What I have seen so far is that a great deal of America's concern with the Iraqi economy now is mainly to do with countering Iran, and especially in the monetary policies and the financial area. It is how to stop Iran from taking advantage of Iraq's relatively liberal economic regime, to stop funds going one way or another to Iran or to Iran's allies. Now, this is, of course, a legitimate concern of the United States because that's how it has formulated that particular policy. But you can't really have a healthy set of economic relations and financial relations with the United States if they're primarily seen through this very narrow prism, because it constrains a lot of our policy making and our strategic directions if investment and financial decisions are seen only through or mainly through this particular perspective. So, in my opinion, I mean, the US also has to broaden its understanding of what it means to support the Iraqi economy. There's another issue coming now into play, which is, let's call it countering China. And in as much as Iraq is sort of at the tail end of the Belt and Roads Initiative of China, nevertheless, I think there is some question as to whether the strategic orientation of Iraq, sort of a look east policy, is going to be met favorably by Washington or not. As things stand right now, and given the tensions between the United States and China on trade and other aspects, I think the answer is no. But that again constrains the pathways in which we can, or in which we have to formulate our economic policies. So if the US sees it as a kind of countering China, it can work to our advantage in some ways, but it can also constrain our ability to diversify our investment sources and to link to what could be an interesting association with an economic model that seems to be succeeding. There are pros and cons on both ways, but in the end, Iraq has to define its own strategic orientation and try to fit it within the overall US framework, assuming that the US formulates a definitive and long-term policy regarding economic engagement with the Middle East and with Iraq in particular.
We'll come back before we finish to questions of the specific economic reforms that you are contemplating. I want to invite our audience if you'd like to join in this conversation and ask questions of your own for Dr. Fuad and Dr. Ali, go to the Q&A function on your screen and submit questions, and we'll review them. And starting in a few minutes, I'll turn to audience questions. For now, I want to ask Dr. Fuad a question that every foreign ministry in the Arab world is thinking about the last several weeks, and that, of course, is the normalization of relations between the United Arab Emirates, one of your neighbors in the Gulf, and Israel. And Dr. Fuad, I want to ask you what you make of that. What thoughts you have, what comments you have, whether you think that's something down the road that's possible for other Arab countries besides the UAE.
Of course, this is, David, as you know, is very sensitive issue, a sensitive problem. And you see, I speak as foreign minister, and we are committed to the resolutions of Arab Summit, especially the one which has been held in Beirut in 2000. And then the summits which followed, and the resolutions is clear about Palestinian issue and Israeli issue. So Iraq is committed to the resolutions of these Arab summits. But of course, each country is free in its own foreign policy. So United Arab Emirates decided to have these ties with Israel, and officially, so they are their own policy. I think within a short time there will be meetings within Arab League, within the framework of Arab League, and we are going to discuss this matter. But this is a very, very sensitive issue for Iraqi politics, and we are, as I said, we are committed to the resolutions which has been taken collectively.
So thank you. I know it's a sensitive question. I wanted to pose it. Thank you for answering it. Dr. Fuad, let me just continue with you for a moment and ask about another issue that you know deeply as well as anyone, and that is the relationship between Baghdad and the KRG. You've been through so many phases in that relationship. How would you describe the relationship between Erbil and the KRG as a whole and Baghdad today? Have we reached a point where these very contentious issues are now closer to resolution, or do we still need to think more about fundamentals in this relationship?
David, we are talking about having dialogue with our neighboring countries, and now we have a strategic dialogue with the United States. It is unfortunate that we didn't create the environment and the atmosphere inside Iraq to have among ourselves serious dialogues. We need serious dialogues. Dialogues among political parties, various political parties. It is part of the reality. We have got parties which belong to the Shia component, and we have got Sunni political parties and Kurdish political parties. We need serious dialogue about these issues. The Kurdish question is a question goes back to the establishment of the current modern Iraq since 1920-21. And since then, various governments in Baghdad, they were dealing with Kurds and Kurdish issue in different way, but mostly they were using violence against Kurds. And the Kurds were part of the change and in 2003, and after 2003, the Iraqi political parties reached an agreement and we got a constitution. One of the problems that we have in Iraq is that many articles in the constitutions has not been translated into laws, and about more than 50 articles in the constitution, which demands to have laws so that it can be translated into reality. When these articles has not been translated into laws, then that means we are going back to the old laws, and all those has to do with Saddam Hussein's laws. So there is a kind of conflict in political culture in Iraq to keep centralism and to strengthen centralism in politics. And on the other hand, there is a new culture which has to do with widening, strengthening federalism culture. And of course, that has to do with the constitution. So part of the problem which exists between KRG and Baghdad has to do with this reality. As I said, more than 50 articles in the constitution has not been implemented. That can solve the problem. But coming back to what happened in recent years. In recent years, especially in the last period of in the government of Prime Minister Abadi, it went wrong. The relationship has been damaged between Erbil and Baghdad. With the formation of new government under the leadership of Adel Abdel Mahdi, both sides, they try to repair the damage. But that doesn't mean they solve the problem. The problems are still there. The problems has to do with many issues, such as, and this is according to the constitution, disputed areas, question of oil policy, budget, and security. And there are other points. But is it possible to solve these problems? I think yes. Because the Kurds, they made it clear that their strategical depth is in Baghdad. And they want to cooperate with Baghdad. And in Baghdad now, there are people who are thinking that indeed we must find a solution for the relationship or the tension between KRG and Baghdad. Because without solving this problem, it will give chances to others, spaces to others to intervene. And that will be dangerous for the Iraqi security, but also dangerous for Iraq as a whole. Both sides, both leaders in Kurdistan, but also in Baghdad, now they want to approach this issue in different way. And there are discussions how to establish a new relationship between KRG and the federal government. I am not pessimistic about this relationship, but at the same time, I'm realistic. There are some problems that must be solved. One of the main problems now is there is a vacuum between the line in which the Peshmerga forces are there and the Iraqi forces. There is a vacuum there. And ISIS terrorists are using this space. So they are moving in the areas where no Iraqi forces or no Peshmerga forces are there. And I'm afraid that if there will not be military or security cooperation between both sides, ISIS will increase its activities. And as a result, once again, ISIS will be strong. And ISIS is in the area around Kirkuk. And that's very dangerous for both, for Iraq and for Kurdistan. But it will be dangerous also for Iraqi economy because of the oil fields in the area. ISIS was targeting always to reach the oil fields and to control oil fields. Once they control some oil fields, then it will be easier to finance themselves and to increase their activities. So this is a part of the reality in this field.
Thank you, Dr. Fuad, and we'll try to keep our eyes on that zone between the KRG and the government forces, where in that seam where ISIS is still powerful. Dr. Ali, I want to ask you about reform of the Iraqi economy and the Iraqi political system. I had the pleasure of reading something you helped prepare called the Manifesto last night, which is a document that talks in detail about reform. And I want to ask you if you would summarize some of the ideas that you think might be possible for Iraq in terms of implementing the spirit of this manifesto. You have a country where people have been in the streets for much of this year demanding change. It's so striking to see young Iraqis saying, we want a different country. We want change. How do you satisfy that hunger in Iraq for change? And maybe you could just outline some of the ideas that are in your manifesto that might be part of the process.
Thank you very much, David. I think also that one has to give credence to the other friends and authors, including Abbas Kadhim at the Atlantic Council, who played a large part in drafting it. The manifesto was designed really as a kind of call to it was called, and the subtext was a program for a plan for national regeneration. And we identified about 20 key challenges that face the country, each one of which obviously is extremely formidable and would require a huge effort to do so. Of course, I mean, the manifesto was not a political program, because it wasn't designed to lead to a kind of mass movement or a political movement, but which I'm trying as much as possible to bring the spirit of into the various strategic options that we have now. These challenges really, as I said, each one of them is extremely formidable, and each one of them would require a great deal of effort and focus. But if you want to boil it down, I mean, the beginning of the cure, as it were, is to look at the institutional problems and the framework in which Iraqi politics and economic decisions and even social decisions are undertaken. And this framework is really not a functioning and effective and productive framework, mainly the institutions of government. It is not so much the centralization, decentralization issue, and this is part of it. But I think that we have to seriously reconfigure the politics of the country. We have to seriously reconfigure the institutional biases of the country. And we have to seriously take into account that as long as the oil revenues are going to be used or abused by the political class, then it is highly improbable that we can have any kind of change, any kind of meaningful change. So if you want to start, as it were, from the ground up, none of the attempts at reform or change can succeed if the mechanism or the transmission mechanism is defective. And we've now had about 18 years of practice with the post-2003 order. And I must say that it needs really a radical overhaul. Now, it is difficult to start a new constitutional dialogue going, but it is absolutely necessary, because without the various gaps and lacunae and the various contradictions and conflicts within the constitutional document have seeped right into the body politic of the country, so that needs to be addressed very, very quickly. And we have to define the various administrative units of the country in a more precise way, in ways that will take into account what has been happening in the country in the last 18 years. Obviously, the idea of federalism, either in the political or its fiscal form, has not been implemented. What we have now is a kind of hodgepodge of a near confederal arrangement with the KRG and a near fiscal federalism that's supposed to govern that relationship. We have apparently power has been apparently devolved to provincial authorities, but they don't have the means or the wherewithals to be able to manage their affairs. And there is, as Dr. Fuad said, a centralizing current that is beginning to reassert itself. So all of these conflicts are now playing out in the institutional mechanism that determines both the politics and the economics of the country. And by institutions, I don't mean just the institutions of government, but also the institutions of the judiciary, the educational institutions, health institutions, social institutions, and so on. They need to be the first port of call. And the way that it has to be done is, I think, in the form of an attempt through a series of dialogues to create a new administrative and political framework for the country, which may end up by having major amendments to the constitution or even perhaps a new constitution. Because the constitution, as I said, has so many areas of ambiguities and has led to a kind of paralysis of government. The checks and balances have led to over-checks and over-balances, and makes it impossible to take any long-term position on anything without it being subject to horrendous political infighting, which in turn has led to the continuing deterioration of the capacities of the government by the infiltration of non-governmental actors into the machinery of governments. We haven't yet reached sort of state capture levels that we have in South Africa, but there's large parts of the governmental machinery is in fact subject to the extraneous control or influence of political parties, various provincial authorities, militias, official and unofficial, which has led to the great curse, which has grown into a cancer in Iraq, which is corruption. And of course, corruption and its twin brother, waste, are really defining features of the Iraqi economy. Now, these demonstrations and so on, it is really a poor commentary on the state of the economy and the political class that has dominated the country, that we are unable to find jobs for people who are coming into the market, except by bloating and pumping up unsustainable employment in the public sector. So we now have really the worst of all worlds. We have all the negative aspects of an over regulated checks and balances that has basically destroyed the possibility of meaningful strategic planning. And we've handed over large chunks of the government and administration to the mercy of outside groups and parties who dominate the electoral process, which makes it difficult to see how this chain can be broken. We may end up, I mean, not economically, but politically, in the same boat as Lebanon, where we've had all these crises and then a near nuclear holocaust a few weeks ago, and it is highly probable that the same people will come to run the country. So unless the elections lead to a profound break with the political inheritance that we have, it's a self-sustaining system that would generate more and more dysfunction, more and more inability to make meaningful long-term strategic decisions. So to me, the starting point is to go to the more enlightened elements in the political class and really face them with reality, that we have now a constitutional framework that is, in my mind, beyond its sell-by date. It needs to be radically overhauled to take into account the realities of its component parts. And we need to really decentralize, not just through cardboard provincial powers that have no basis, but actually transfer real resources to the provinces and transfer decision-making, including those relating to employment. So to me, The first port of call is to look at the institutional framework in which Iraqi politics and economic decisions are taken. And in this complex matrix of the country, where it is difficult to see how we can create another version of a centralized state, that's not possible anymore. But the alternative that we have is a kind of chaotic free-for-all that is leading to the kind of outcomes that are no longer acceptable, let alone sustainable. Most people demonstrate to get jobs in the government sector because there are no jobs in the private sector, because there is no private sector we're speaking of, because the environment, the enabling environment is not there. And then the benefits and pensions that come from a public sector employment makes the public sector the first and last port of call for people looking for jobs. We're also constrained by the legal framework that forces the government to employ people simply because they're entitled to these jobs. So it is, before we go anywhere, we have to redo the institutional framework of the post-2003 state, which have reached really a critical mass now, that if we don't do something in the very, very near term, the whole system can come crashing down. So it is an institutional issue over and above everything else.
That's a powerful answer. I'm struck that both of you focused on the need to address constitutional issues as a pathway to the future. We have some wonderful questions from our audience, and I'm going to get right into those. And I'm going to start with somebody who, as our speakers know, is a friend of Iraq for many decades past, and that's Peter Galbraith. And Peter has a question for each of you. His question for Minister Fuad Hussein, and we'll start with you, Dr. Fuad. Could you discuss the federal government of Iraq's approach to Syria, and in particular towards Rojava, where the U.S. has a significant presence? And then I'll also mention the question for Minister Allawi, who can follow. Peter Galbraith asks, could you describe the status of negotiations with the KRG over the allocation of the federal budget? And I'll just throw in one more question that came in, Dr. Ali. What's the current status of negotiations with the IMF? But let's start with Dr. Fuad. What is the situation in terms of Iraqi relations with Rojava?
Hi, Peter. How are you, Peter? It's great to have you and talk to you. Peter, as you know, Rojava is not a recognized area or region in Syria. But the situation in Syria is very complicated. And since 2011, when the demonstrations started and then the fight started, in fact, the fight in Syria, I am talking about Syria in general, became also an international fight. There are proxy groups, proxy wars inside Syria from different regional powers, but also international powers. So to talk about Syria, and then you are dealing with the complex issue. As for the Kurds in Syria, the Kurds in Syria, of course, in alliance with the American, they fought ISIS terrorists, and they were one of the main forces in fighting ISIS. And in this framework, of course, we were also fighting ISIS, we the Iraqis, and there was many international groups also fighting ISIS. It was an international fight against ISIS. So the Kurds received this support from various countries, including the United States, the Kurds in Syria and Rojava. We don't have official relationship with Rojava or with the Kurds in Syria. But it is also a fact that some political parties established this relationship with political parties of the Kurdish political parties in Syria. So officially, we don't have any relationship. But we support the struggle of any group against ISIS. It doesn't matter where. ISIS is a terrorist organization, is a threat to Iraq, is a threat to peoples in the Middle East. So any group which struggle and fight against ISIS, it has our support. But that doesn't mean we have officially a relationship with these groups. I must say that there are various political parties who have established a relationship with the Kurdish political parties inside Syria, as they established a relationship with other political parties somewhere else. As for the Syrian government, we hope that the solution in Syria will be solved through negotiations, and we need peace in Syria. Without having peace in Syria, there will be always a threat to Iraq and to Iraqi people, because those terrorists, they are not recognizing the borders and they are crossing the borders. In fact, when ISIS controlled 1/3 of the country in Iraq, it controlled also almost half of the territory in Syria for a while. So ISIS forms a threat if it will be in Syria or in Iraq against us. And we are supporting those people who are fighting ISIS.
Dr. Ali, what about Peter's question about the KRG budget issues? And also, I'm curious about the status of your conversations with the IMF.
The KRG budget issues is really a very thorny problem. It's been going on for a very long time. And it's really to do with the murkiness and lack of clarity as to what constitutes the federal aspects of the Iraqi constitution and the manner in which the fiscal federalist framework and the distribution of revenues and is going to be or was being tackled. And frankly, there is no clear framework. We started off at the beginning with a flat transfer of a certain proportion of the budget, around 17%, to the KRG in the early days when I was in the government in 2005, 2006. These numbers were established by the cabinet of Dr. Allawi, my cousin Riyad Allawi. And then that went on for a while as a reasonable basis for. And then, of course, a lot of things came in that began to complicate matters. The most important one is that the KRG began to produce and export oil in relatively large numbers, and in terms of the control over the borders and of customs and so on. So these extraneous issues were reflected in the way that the transfers from the center to the KRG took place. And these percentages that started off at 17% was at some point were considered to be too high. They dropped to 15% and 12.5%, 12.7% and so on, out of which things were deducted. And so the entire framework in which the relationship of the fiscal relationship between the center and the KRG became more and more entangled with issues that were brushed under the carpet and were not tackled head on. These issues have reached the point now where we need to basically revisit the whole thing and go back to basic principles. The Constitution is certainly not a document on which both parties, i.e. the government, the federal government, and the KRG agree on its interpretation. There are varying interpretations given as to the control of oil, who owns oil, what happens to natural resources when they're exported, who controls customs. who controls the assets of the federal government in the regions and so on. It is a document that is full of ambiguities, and these ambiguities have been used and abused by both parties. So I want to be fair here. So we need to go back really to back to first principles to define the contours of this fiscal federalist nature that we have, because in the last year, last 6 months, since October of last year, this problem has become much more thorny and much more problematic politically to resolve, because added to these technical issues, there are also legal issues, legal challenges that are making it even more complex and more murky. And in the last, in the last 4 months, we've had one crisis after another as to the amount and the legitimacy of the transfers of the federal government to the KRG. And of course, there's opinions on the other side, so it's not a one-sided. The way out of this, and I think we've reached the point now where we cannot continue politically. It's not feasible to continue with this. Things boil to a crisis, and then stopgap measures are taken, and then it's sedated for a while, then it blows up again. This kind of stop-go approach will not be workable anymore. So perhaps the prompt of the fiscal aspects of it, and the fact that the KRG, and as well as the central government, is being challenged seriously by the falling oil prices and by the revenue issues that have resulted therefrom. So my contention is that, and I would push for it, is to basically in the next few weeks or months to come up with a different framework for assessing and for reaching an acceptable and politically acceptable and fair and equitable distribution of revenues, depending on the absolute need to resolve a lot of these outstanding issues that have not been satisfactorily resolved. So I know that the KRG is going through very, very serious issue of paying its civil service. We are also, every month we face these problems. In the past, the KRG has partly resolved it by international borrowings, which have been costly and have taken large slices of its oil income. All of these issues, I think, must be looked at with a will to resolve them in a fair and equitable way. And at least as far as the Ministry of Finance is concerned, that's the approach that we intend to take. Regarding the IMF, we've been in discussions with them twice now during the last few days, including as recently as 2 hours ago. We don't really need any additional funding, as I said. We can manage our affairs, but what we need is an international imprint to a series of quite difficult strategic and policy changes, radical changes that we have to make for our economic affairs. And if the IMF stands behind it and begins to exert its sort of global authority on the political class, indirectly, of course, it will make the possibility of meaningful change that much greater. So we know that the IMF can bring conditionality to some of its lending. So we're looking at the possibility of doing perhaps what is known as a rapid finance instrument, but much more importantly, a limited borrowings from the IMF, backed up by what is known as an EFF, which is a program that obliges the government to undertake certain structural changes over the medium term. So the talks with the IMF have been positive. They've been very supportive, and I think we will approach them in the next few weeks towards a program that would involve them examining and hopefully approving and supporting the reform program that we hope to establish.
So we have three very interesting questions dealing with energy issues. I think these are probably primarily for Dr. Allawi, but if Dr. Fuad has any thoughts, jump in after. Let me just briefly read these and then ask Dr. Allawi to comment. The first question is from Ambassador Doug Silliman. He asks, the Prime Minister and delegation signed several agreements and MOUs with American companies, especially in the energy sector. This is not new. Over the past 5 years, many MOUs have been signed, but bureaucratic inertia and political opposition have prevented them from becoming real projects. How does this government plan to make these projects and investments real over the objection of some in the bureaucracy and political structure? That's question number one. Question two from an anonymous attendee, a very interesting question. Does Iraq intend to substitute for Iranian gas, Iranian energy imports, given the US sanctions against Iran? If so, what is the source and timeline? And then question three from Michael Gordon, one of our real students, historians of Iraq. Michael now with the Wall Street Journal asks, did the Iraqi delegation discuss its plans to cooperate with Saudi Arabia in the energy sector with the U.S. during this visit? How is the U.S. supporting the Iraqi-Saudi projects? And can you please provide some examples of the most important emerging Iraqi-Saudi energy ventures connecting the electrical grid, Saudi investments in Iraq, and the like? So there are three interesting questions. I'll turn it over to Dr. Allawi.
I'll try to answer this question as I can. Regarding the first question, why are these agreements different? Well, one of them I think is different in the sense that it's beyond the MOU, which is the gas gathering project in Artawi, where Honeywell and UOP are involved. There, I think it goes, as I said, beyond just MOUs, and it's reached a point where I think implementation will take place over the course of the next few months. So we're talking about a major multi-billion-dollar investment in the area of Artawi to draw on the gas fields as part of the gas gathering project, and to sell the dry gas back to the Ministry of Oil, or to move on to a power generating project. So that is on. This also dovetails to the some possibility of Saudi groups getting involved in this Artawi project, and we're talking here about Saudi Aramco and the Aqua Group, which is partly owned by the government. The other MOU that was signed of some significance is with Chevron to undertake a detailed exploration program in the province of Liqar, Nasiriyah. And that also, I think, is beyond an MOU stage. It is a detailed drilling program and 3D mapping of what we think is a very, very significant undiscovered oil-producing area. These, of course, are not major projects. Chevron's I'm talking. It will not be a major project unless oil and gas is discovered. But these two elements, I think, are critical. The gas gathering will move on into a specific project, I think, over the next 2 months, and we're discussing the funding details with the Exim Bank and with UKEF and so on. Chevron is not a huge project in terms of investments, but it could lead to major oil field developments if oil and gas is in fact discovered. The second question relating to Iran gas, this has been going on for several years now, and the US has been giving exemptions and extensions to our imports of both Iranian electricity and Iran gas. It is unlikely that we can find a short-term substitute, but a medium-term effort can be done by linking the Iraqi grid to the Gulf grid, and there are 2 points at which it can be linked, either in Saudi Arabia or through Kuwait. And these are, again, projects that are on the verge of being defined and designed and put out to tenders. So I assume that the dependence on Iranian gas and electricity imports will begin to trail down significantly sometime next year. But between now and then, we have very little options except to continue to draw on this source. The cooperation with Saudi Arabia, I think I've answered it. It's focused now on getting the major Saudi parastatals like Aramco and Aqua to be involved in the gas gathering Artawi project. And the reason why the Saudis are interested in this is because you can actually ring fence it so that you don't have to deal with the red tape and bureaucracy that bedevils some foreign investors and other outside of the oil sector. And the electrical grid will be tied up probably both in Saudi Arabia as well as in Kuwait, although it's easier in Kuwait because the voltage and so on is not that different from the Iraqi grid. We're looking at this point of activating the major commitments made by Saudi Arabia and the Kuwait Reconstruction Conference of 2018, where the Saudis provided export finance as well as prompted the Islamic Development Bank, which is not controlled but is influenced by Saudi Arabia, to provide additional finance to Iraq. But until and unless the business environment in Iraq is improved substantially, I personally don't see, no matter what we do in the government, any real flow of Saudi private sector investment outside of the areas that can be, to some extent, ring-fenced. We're trying to get Saudis to be involved also in some of the larger projects which are funded by them. For example, the stadium, which is going to be funded to about $1 billion. Obviously, the major work will go to some Saudi contractors. So the idea is to increase the commitment of Saudi Arabia to the Iraqi economy from a very low level now, which is around bilateral trade of around $400 million, compared to, let's say, bilateral trade with Turkey and Iran of more than 10 or $12 billion. So there's a lot of growth there, possibilities there.
So we're almost to the end of our time, and I'm going to just gather two questions for Dr. Fuad, and then if Abbas Khadim would like to say a word at the end to close our session, I'll invite him to join us. But Dr. Fuad, this is a question initially from Mohsen Taherzadeh, and he notes that the U.S., has been reported in the last few days, has requested the trigger mechanism, the so-called snapback mechanism against Iran. And the simple question is, does Iraq support that U.S. request? The second question I'll ask now and then let you answer both. It's from Rita Husseini, a recent graduate of the School of Foreign Services, Georgetown, who notes some draw parallels between Lebanon and Iraq, to the point that one might assume that their situation, perhaps their fates in terms of Iranian influence, are similar. Do you have any thoughts about that parallel? So, Dr. Fuad, let me ask you to make final comments, and then we'll I hope get a final word from Abbas.
Thank you very much, David. You see, once again, we are coming back to the conflict between Tehran and Washington, and I think I explained that. As for this comparison between Lebanon and the situation in Lebanon and Iraq, of course, one can say that the pillars that exist, which has to do with the political system in Lebanon, some of these pillars also exist in Iraq, if we are talking about women's Sunni, Shia, and there we have got Christian, and here we have got Kurds. So there are three main pillars, let's say, in each country. And of course, the influence of the Iranian in Lebanon is well known, as it is well known in Iraq. That's part of the reality. We are not denying that. But the political situation in Iraq and the also financial situation or economic situation in Iraq is rather different than Lebanon. You see, as my colleague Dr. Ali mentioned, the Iraqi economy and the Iraqi budget is depending heavily on oil revenue and oil income. So sometimes that's bad because we have to do with the one pillar of economy, and that is oil. And this is the main one. But in Lebanon, as far as their economy, even they don't have that. They are depending heavily on other things, especially on the Lebanese who are in exile, and they were helping their economy. So economic-wise, there is difference in Lebanon and Iraq, but also politically. And if we are talking about geopolitics, I think the situation in Iraq is different. So the influence of the Iranian inside Iraq also you cannot compare it with Lebanon, although there are some similarities in this case. However, each country has got its own identity, its own history. It is the leadership in Iraq make it clear now. The current government make it clear that we want to have a good relationship with Iran, and Iran is our neighbor. That's also a different point. I mean, comparing Iran with Lebanon. Geographically, it has to do with Iran. While Lebanese, they don't have that relationship. So we are making it clear that we want to have our decision in our hands. And I think the leadership in Iraq, with the support of the international community, will reach that point one day. Because there are various political leaders and political parties inside Iraq, which sees that the country must come back to his own people. And the decision must not be hijacked by others. Thank you.
So I want to thank our two speakers. Big problems, smart people in the two of you to deal with them. I know we all wish you luck, and we're grateful that you took time during your visit to share your ideas with us. If Abbas can get on the line briefly, I'll let him say a final word. Abbas, are you able to join us? It appears that the answer is no. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council
David, I'm here, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the muting and unmuting is central. So there was a couple of seconds. David, I'm grateful and honored to have you join us today. Thank you very much for conducting this rich, informative, and timely conversation with two of Iraq's foremost statesmen, as I said in the outset. I am also very grateful to my friends and people I look up to all the time and respect, highly distinguished, not just in Iraq, but internationally, Dr. Ali Allawi and Dr. Fuad Hussein. Here, everyone in the audience and all of those who care about Iraq and follow Iraq, join me, I am sure, in wishing the government and our distinguished guests all the luck and all the success in this hard task. And it is hard. The challenges are very high, but also, as you mentioned, we have the competence and also every other reason to be optimistic about this. To our audience here and online on the internet, I'm very grateful, wishing all of you safety and health. And once again, on behalf of the Atlantic Council and the Iraq Initiative, we are very grateful for everyone's participation and look forward to many more of these excellent conversations. Thank you all. and God bless you.